You were always just the muscle, Ryan. The company was mine from the start. My partner Derek's voice sliced through the low hum of conversation in the packed brewery like a blade, and the room went dead quiet as 30 pairs of eyes flicked toward me, half pitying, half curious. While Derek raised his glass with that smug grin that had always made me want to knock his teeth out, and the laughter that followed from his little circle of sycophants burned hotter than the whiskey in my chest. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. My name is Ryan Callahan. I'm 38 years old, born and raised in Dayton, Ohio, and I swear in that moment, as the sound of Derek's toast echoed off the worn brick walls, I could feel my entire life threatening to collapse. Though even then, a small part of me clung to a secret advantage I'd been nursing for months. Something no one in that room suspected. Something that would change everything when the time came. But to understand how much his words cut, you need to know what we built. Or rather, what I built with my own two hands and every sleepless night that stacked into years, turning a kid who grew up on Route 35, eating meatloaf at a greasy spoon diner after football practice, into the man who created a company that everyone in that room wanted a piece of. Derek and I weren't just business partners. We were supposed to be friends, brothers almost. Ever since those college nights in Columbus, when we'd sit on the hood of my beat-up Chevy Cavalier outside the Waffle House at 2 a.m, sketching dreams on napkins with coffee rings bleeding through the ink. He always had the charm, the quick words, the handshake that made people trust him, while I had the grit, the long hours, the drive to turn ideas into revenue. And for years it worked, or so I thought. We rose together, him in polished suits shaking hands with investors, me grinding in the back office, pulling 18-hour days until my eyes blurred, and somewhere along the line I let myself believe that loyalty went both ways. That's why it hit harder than I can explain to hear him stand in front of our employees, our community, and claim the blood I'd spilled as his alone, reducing me to nothing but a set of calloused hands he could discard once the real money rolled in. The betrayal wasn't sudden, not really, if I'm honest with myself. Looking back, the signs were there. The missed calls, the quiet meetings I wasn't invited to, the sudden change in the tone of boardroom conversations, where Derek's voice started carrying more weight than mine, as though I'd somehow become an afterthought in the very company that bore my sweat in its foundations. I still remember the night 3 months earlier, sitting in the corner booth at Tony's Bar and Grill, the same place my dad used to take me after Little League wins, when Derek slid a document across the table with a casual grin, saying it was just a minor update to our partnership agreement. He laughed when I took my time reading it, joked that I was still the cautious one, but underneath that laughter was something sharper, something almost mocking. And I should have known. My father always said a man's handshake was sacred, and Derek and I had sealed this company with one 10 years ago in a garage that smelled of gasoline and cheap beer. But somewhere along the way, Derek learned how to smile while sticking a knife in someone's ribs. That handshake, our old ritual of clasping hands, pressing thumbs to the scar on my palm from a high school fight I never should have picked, became our symbolic oath, a stupid little tradition that felt unbreakable then. But in that brewery, when Derek twisted our history into his victory speech, it turned sour in my gut, and I knew that same gesture, that handshake, would one day be the thing that buried him. As the crowd shifted awkwardly, I forced a smile, lifted my glass, and let the bitterness settle like ash in my throat. Because if there's one thing I learned growing up in Ohio winters, shoveling driveways before school just to keep the lights on, it's how to suffer silently until the right moment comes. They thought I was broken in that moment, thought I'd swallow the humiliation and retreat into the shadows while Derek reaped the rewards. But deep down, I had already made a decision, quiet and sharp as a razor in my mind. I would not let this stand. I would not be erased. For years, I'd carried the company on my back, sacrificing birthdays, relationships, my health, even my sense of self at times. And if Derek thought he could strip me of that and parade me as the muscle he no longer needed, he was about to learn that the very foundation of this business was something I'd set up in a way he could never unravel, because long before the money rolled in, before the investors with their shiny shoes and smug grins, I made sure there were pieces of the puzzle that only I held. That night, as the applause for Derek's hollow speech died down and he basked in the glow of stolen credit, I clenched my fist around the cool glass of beer, felt the pulse in my palm where our handshake had once sealed trust, and decided that no matter how long it took, I would reclaim everything he thought he'd stolen. What I didn't know then was just how far he would go to push me down, or how close he would come to destroying everything I'd built, but I also knew that the scar on my hand wasn't just a reminder of past fights, it was a promise, one that Derek had already forgotten, but I never would. And back then, I didn't realize the one detail he overlooked would be his undoing. The next few weeks after that brewery humiliation felt like walking through a house fire while pretending the smoke didn't sting my lungs, because Derek wasted no time tightening his grip on everything we had built, strutting through the office like a king who had finally claimed his crown while I sat in the corner, silent, watching, learning, letting him believe he'd already won. He changed the locks on my office door and told me it was a restructuring necessity, moved my desk into the bullpen like I was some junior associate, and every time I walked past the conference room, I'd catch a glimpse of him holding meetings with people who used to be my allies, now laughing a little too hard at his jokes, nodding a little too eagerly at his half-baked strategies, and each smile dug deeper than the last. My name began disappearing from documents, my signature replaced by his flourish, and at the monthly all-hands meeting, he called me out in front of everyone, saying, "Ryan here knows the grind, but we're moving into a new era now, a smarter one." And the room gave that forced applause that told me most of them hated it, but none of them had the spine to speak up. It was a chess game now, and Derek thought he'd cornered my king, but what he didn't realize was that long before he started maneuvering, I had already laid out pieces on the board he didn't even know existed. I'd been preparing quietly, for years, not because I expected Derek to betray me, but because something in my bones never trusted permanence, and so I'd created small redundancies, backup trails, a series of rights and filings and intellectual property loopholes that all led back to me and only me, though I made sure never to show a flicker of that knowledge on my face. Outwardly, I let myself look smaller, shoulders hunched, eyes tired, like a man defeated, because if there's one thing an egomaniac can't resist, it's believing he broke you. But pretending to be broken didn't mean I wasn't bleeding. At night, when I drove home through the quiet back roads of Ohio, headlights bouncing off the empty fields, the weight of it all pressed down until I could barely breathe. I'd stop at Mel's Diner on Route 48, the kind of place where the coffee is bottomless and the waitresses still call you "hun," and I'd sit there with a slice of cold pecan pie, staring at the chipped ceramic mug in my hands, wondering how everything I'd fought for had boiled down to this humiliation. Derek even started circling my personal life like a vulture, showing up at the same places I went, sliding in beside people I called friends, sowing little seeds of doubt about me, as if eroding my reputation wasn't enough. He wanted to isolate me completely. One night, I found out he'd taken a client I'd nurtured for years, a small family-run hardware chain, and lured them into signing an exclusive deal by promising better terms I knew we couldn't deliver. When I confronted him in the parking lot, his smirk said everything. "It's just business, Ryan. Nothing personal." Nothing personal yet. Every move was soaked in the acid of his jealousy, his hunger to not just take what I'd built, but to grind me underfoot while he did it. Still, I bit my tongue, forced my fists into my pockets, and walked away because the one thing my father taught me was that a man who swings too early often loses the fight, and I couldn't afford to lose, not now. There were moments when I almost caved, almost let the anger boil over, like when Derek hosted a founder's dinner and toasted himself in front of investors who used to look to me for vision. But every time my temper surged, I thought about the scar on my hand from our old handshake ritual. And I reminded myself that some promises aren't meant to be shouted in the moment. They're meant to be delivered quietly when the other man least expects it. Still, Derek wasn't satisfied with just stripping me of pride. He wanted to strip me of options, and he came close. One morning, I arrived at the office to find a formal notice taped to my desk. Effective immediately, I was being removed from all operational duties, relegated to an advisory role that paid me a token salary. He didn't even tell me face to face, he just left that paper for me like a death certificate, and the eyes of the staff around me said they all knew but none dared intervene. That night, I drove out past the edge of town, down the winding country roads to my parents' old house, the one that had sat empty since Mom passed, and I stood on the porch, listening to the cicadas whir in the summer air, remembering her voice telling me that no betrayal, no matter how cruel, could take away who I really was. That memory steadied me enough to walk back into the storm the next day, and even though Derek strutted around like a man who had already buried me, I carried inside me the knowledge that there was one thing he hadn't noticed, one silent thread that ran through every contract, every patent, every foundational detail of the company, my mark, invisible to anyone not looking for it, like the scar beneath our handshake. I knew the clock was ticking. Derek was planning something bigger, something that would try to erase me entirely, and the deadline was closer than I liked. But I also knew that for all his scheming, all his victories, he was walking straight into the trap he thought he was setting for me. Because back then, I didn't realize the one detail he overlooked would be his undoing. By the time fall settled over Ohio and the maples along Main Street bled red and gold, Derek had fully convinced himself that I was finished, and in truth, he had every reason to believe it. My name was gone from the headlines, my office reduced to a corner cubicle, my presence at board meetings treated like a courtesy more than a necessity. And to the outside world, I looked like a man who had been gutted and left to dry in the cold wind of his partner's ambition. But what Derek didn't see, what nobody saw, was the quiet way I had been threading my plan through the cracks he left in his arrogance, one move at a time. He called a shareholders' meeting for October, a big show at the Marriott downtown, promising to unveil the next phase of the company's expansion, and the buzz around it was electric. I sat in the back row as he strutted on stage in his tailored suit, flashing that politician's smile, outlining acquisitions and partnerships that sounded brilliant on the surface, but carried poison underneath because they leaned on intellectual property filings he thought he controlled, but that I had quietly secured in my own name years earlier, tucked away in the corners of the patent office where only a paranoid founder would think to look. As the room applauded, I caught my reflection in the glass of a water pitcher and almost laughed, because the trap was already set, and Derek was walking across it, blindfolded, bragging about deals that couldn't legally exist without me, and the more he talked, the deeper he dug himself. Still, I kept my head low, clapping politely like any other attendee, because timing mattered and the deadline I had been waiting for was tied not just to corporate filings, but to something far more personal. The anniversary of the night Derek and I first shook hands in my parents' garage, sealing a dream that only one of us had ever truly believed in. In the weeks leading up to that anniversary, Derek doubled down on trying to crush me. He hired lawyers to pressure me into selling my advisory shares, dangling what he called a generous payout that was really nothing more than hush money, and when I refused, he went further, leaking rumors to local business journals that I was unstable, difficult, a liability who had dragged the company down while he lifted it up. Friends I'd known for years started crossing the street to avoid me, and even at Mel's diner, where the waitresses had once joked that my coffee mug was practically reserved, I felt the shift in their tone, the slight hesitation before pouring a refill, as though Derek's poison had seeped into every corner of my life. One night, sitting alone in my truck outside the office, I heard Derek's laughter echoing through the open window of the building, his voice booming as he celebrated with a group of junior execs, bragging about the dead weight he'd finally cut loose, and my hand tightened on the steering wheel until the scar from our handshake throbbed with the memory of a promise that a betrayal like his could not go unanswered. Still, I played my role, perfectly stooped shoulders, weary eyes, the look of a man who had accepted defeat, and Derek, blinded by his need to humiliate me, never once thought to look deeper. He believed he'd already won, which made him reckless, and that recklessness was the rope I was quietly winding around his neck. The real turning point came one brisk November morning when Derek called an emergency meeting to announce that the company had secured a massive government contract, the kind of deal that would cement his place as a visionary in the eyes of the world. He strode into the room with cameras trailing behind him, flashing contracts in the air like holy scripture, declaring that the future was his, and I sat in the corner, taking notes as though I were just another irrelevant advisor. But what no one in that room realized was that the patents underlying that contract, the ones that gave us the right to deliver on the promised technology, had never truly belonged to the company. They belonged to me, filed under my name with a small clause Derek had overlooked because he was too eager to celebrate. It wasn't an accident either. Years earlier, while he was busy charming investors, I had quietly ensured that the most critical components of our business were tied not to the company itself but to the individual who had invented them. That detail had been buried under layers of legalese, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look, and Derek, in all his arrogance, had never looked. As I watched him hold up those contracts, basking in the applause, I almost pitied him because he didn't know he was standing on a trapdoor. Almost. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I pulled out the old notebook where I'd first sketched the designs, coffee stains bleeding through the pages, and I ran my thumb over the ink like a man touching a scar. The plan was almost ready. Derek had scored another public victory, another headline, another moment of glory, but this time, his victory wasn't just hollow. It was the fuse I'd been waiting to light. And back then, I didn't realize the one detail he overlooked would be his undoing. The night of the government contract signing gala arrived cold and sharp, the kind of November evening where the wind cuts through your coat, no matter how tightly you button it. And as I stepped out of my truck in front of the downtown Dayton Convention Center, I could smell the roasted chestnuts from a street vendor mixing with the metallic tang of exhaust in the air. And I knew this was the moment I had been waiting for, the night when Derek would finally step into the snare he'd been tightening around his own neck. Inside, the ballroom glowed with chandeliers and the hum of expensive conversations. Every local politician, business leader, and investor gathered to watch Derek parade himself as the genius behind our company's success. His handshakes as oily as ever, his laughter too loud, his eyes scanning the room like a conqueror surveying his kingdom, and when he spotted me standing by the bar, he smirked, raised his glass, and whispered just loud enough for the crowd around him to hear. "Didn't think you'd show your face, Muscle." I smiled back, quiet, calm, because I already knew what he didn't, that by the end of the night, the very foundation he stood on would crumble, and he would have no one to blame but himself. They called the ceremony to order, and Derek took the stage, holding up a folder with the freshly signed government contracts like a trophy, his voice booming as he told the crowd how he had built this company, how he had led it into the future, and as the applause swelled, I slipped a hand into my jacket pocket and touched the small silver recorder I'd carried there. The one I'd used weeks earlier to capture Derek bragging in private about how he'd cut me out, how he'd manipulated documents, how he'd tricked shareholders with numbers that weren't entirely real. But the recorder was just insurance. The real weapon wasn't in my pocket. It was in the contracts themselves, in the patents Derek had built his empire on, patents that legally bore my name, patents I had quietly transferred to a holding company under my sole control the week before, making Derek's grand contract worth less than the paper it was printed on. When the applause died, I raised my hand from the back of the room, and the master of ceremonies, recognizing me, hesitated before nodding in my direction. "Ryan Callahan," I said, stepping forward, my voice steady, filling the room with the plain-spoken rhythm of a man who grew up in Ohio diners, not country clubs. "I need to clarify something before everyone here celebrates a contract that doesn't actually exist." The room rippled with murmurs, cameras swiveling, Derek's smile faltering for the first time as I walked up the steps and stood beside him, my scarred palm visible under the stage lights. "You see, Derek here has been bragging about leading this company into the future, but what he hasn't told you is that the technology behind these contracts, the intellectual property, was never his to sell. It's mine. Filed years ago in my name, tied directly to me, and last week reassigned to a separate entity with no connection to Derek's company." I held up a folder of my own, the certified documents gleaming in the light, stamped and sealed. Gasps rippled across the ballroom, investors clutching their programs, reporters leaning forward like bloodhounds catching a scent, and Derek's face drained of color as he stammered, "That's not possible. You signed." But his voice cracked, his certainty crumbling. "I signed nothing that gave you ownership," I cut in, my tone sharp as winter air. "You overlooked the one detail that mattered, Derek, because you were too busy trying to humiliate me. You called me muscle, treated me like dead weight, but while you were busy shaking hands and taking credit, I was protecting the heart of what we built." The silence in that room was heavier than any applause I'd ever heard, and then, almost instinctively, Derek lunged toward me, trying to grab the documents, and in that split second, I extended my hand the way we used to, palm open, scar showing, offering him the old handshake that had once symbolized trust, brotherhood, a promise between two young men in a garage. For a moment he froze, his eyes darting from my scar to the cameras flashing, and I saw the calculation in his face, the desperate urge to salvage dignity. But when his hand twitched toward mine, I pulled it back, slow and deliberate, letting the rejection hang in the air like a guillotine. The crowd erupted, some with gasps, others with applause, and in that gesture, that refusal to seal a promise with a liar, Derek was finished. Within hours, the story hit every outlet. The fraudulent contracts, the intellectual property loophole, the recording of Derek mocking investors that I leaked just to make sure the knife twisted all the way in. By morning, Derek's name was mud, his empire crumbling, his so-called allies scattering like rats from a sinking ship. And I didn't just reclaim what he tried to steal. I'd buried him with the very handshake he had betrayed, turning our once sacred ritual into the symbol of his downfall. And here's the double twist that nobody saw coming. I didn't take the company back. I didn't want it anymore. Watching Derek fall made me realize that what I loved wasn't the boardrooms or the contracts. It was the building, the creating, the nights of sketching ideas on diner napkins with coffee stains spreading like galaxies. So after exposing Derek, I sold my stake to an eager competitor for more than enough to live 10 lives, and I walked away. I bought my parents' old house, fixed it up, and turned the garage where our dream began into my own workshop. Not for profit, not for power, but for me. Derek ended up bankrupt, shunned, forgotten, the scar of his betrayal carved into every ruined deal, while I found something he never could piece. In the end, the true revenge wasn't just destroying him. It was proving to myself that I was never just the muscle. I was the heart, the mind, the builder. And when I close my fist around that scar on my palm, I don't think of Derek anymore. I think of promises kept to myself, to the boy who dreamed big on Route 35, and to the man who finally learned that sometimes the sweetest victory isn't taking everything back. It's knowing you never truly lost it in the first place. If you enjoyed this story, please give a thumbs up to the video and consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful true life stories.